The Balaclava problem, when online anonymity becomes a shield for criminality. There is a fundamental problem in the way criminal behavior on the internet is often approached. Anonymity can become an unofficial shield against enforcement. The problem is not that anonymity exists. There are legitimate reasons why people may wish to remain anonymous online. Victims, whistleblowers, vulnerable people, political dissidents, and ordinary members of the public may all have legitimate reasons for protecting their identity. The problem arises when anonymity is used deliberately to facilitate wrongdoing, and when the fact that somebody is anonymous subsequently becomes a reason why nobody is prepared to investigate what they have done. That creates a very dangerous inversion of responsibility. Imagine somebody committing a crime in the physical world while wearing a balaclava. The police would not ordinarily respond by saying, "We cannot see their face, therefore there is nothing we can do." The balaclava would be recognized as an investigative obstacle, not as a defense to the underlying crime. Yet this can be remarkably close to what victims experience online. Someone can create an anonymous account, impersonate another person, threaten somebody, repeatedly harass them, stalk them, publish malicious allegations, coordinate abuse, interfere with their employment or reputation, or engage in other potentially criminal conduct, and when the victim reports it, the immediate obstacle becomes, who is this person? If the answer is I don't know, the matter can sometimes appear to fall into a gap between policing, civil law, and platform moderation. But that is precisely where the problem begins. An unknown offender is still an offender. The identity of an offender is an important part of an investigation. It is not, however, the definition of whether an offense has occurred. The correct sequence should be, what happened? Is what happened potentially criminal? What evidence exists? What investigative steps are available to identify the person responsible? It should not effectively become, we do not know who did it, therefore we cannot do anything. That would be an extraordinary principle to apply anywhere else. If a person breaks into a house wearing a balaclava, the fact that they have concealed their identity does not transform the burglary into a civil dispute. It does not make the victim responsible for identifying them. It does not give the offender immunity. The concealment of identity simply makes the investigation more difficult. Online crime should be approached according to the same fundamental principle. Anonymity can compound harm. There is another important factor. Anonymity does not merely make an existing offense harder to investigate. In some circumstances, it can increase the likelihood, frequency, and severity of harmful behavior in the first place. A person who believes that they cannot be identified may perceive the consequences of their behavior as substantially lower. That changes the risk calculation. A person who would never walk up to a stranger in the street and repeatedly threaten them, publicly accuse them of serious wrongdoing, follow them, contact their family, interfere with their livelihood, or encourage others to abuse them may nevertheless behave in exactly that way behind an anonymous account. The screen does not remove the behavior. It removes the immediate visibility of the perpetrator. And when anonymity is combined with the perception that law enforcement will not investigate unidentified offenders, the result can be a particularly dangerous feedback loop. Anonymity, perceived impunity, increased behavior, greater harm, greater difficulty identifying the perpetrator, reduced enforcement, further perceived impunity. That is the cycle that needs to be broken. The victim should not become the investigator. There is also an important question of responsibility. A victim can provide screenshots, URLs, usernames, dates, messages, recordings, witnesses, and other evidence. They can preserve information and report what has happened. But it cannot be reasonable to place the entire burden of identifying an anonymous offender upon the victim and then conclude that no crime can be investigated because the victim has been unable to identify the person. That would effectively create a class of offenders for whom the first stage of criminal accountability is outsourced to their victim. The Internet makes that particularly problematic because platforms may hold information that an ordinary member of the public cannot access: account registration information, login records, IP information, device information, timestamps, and other technical evidence. Whether such information can lawfully be obtained will depend upon the circumstances and the applicable legal processes. But that is precisely why investigative mechanisms exist. The question should be whether the available evidence and legal powers justify investigation, not whether the victim has somehow managed to unmask the anonymous offender themselves. The police have an important role in closing this gap. This does not mean that every anonymous account should become a police matter. Nor does it mean that anonymity itself should be treated as evidence of criminality. It means something much simpler. Anonymity should never be allowed to become a reason for automatically downgrading potentially criminal conduct. Where there is credible evidence of an offense, the fact that the perpetrator is unidentified should be treated as an investigative challenge. Indeed, there is a strong argument that repeated anonymous offending should be treated as a particularly important investigative problem, because anonymity can make offending easier to repeat, harder for victims to escape, and harder for conventional deterrents to reach. The appropriate question is therefore not, can we identify this person immediately? It is, what evidence exists, what offense may have occurred, and what proportionate investigative steps are available to establish who is responsible. That is a very different approach. The platform cannot simply become the new blind spot. This also brings social media companies directly into the discussion. Platforms provide the infrastructure through which anonymous accounts operate. That does not make platforms responsible for every unlawful act committed by their users. But it does mean that platforms occupy a crucial position in the accountability chain. If a platform permits a person to operate anonymously, it must also recognize that anonymity creates particular risks. The principle should be straightforward: privacy for legitimate users, accountability for unlawful conduct. Those principles are not contradictory. A person can be anonymous to the general public while still being potentially identifiable through lawful investigative processes. That is the important distinction. The answer is not necessarily to abolish anonymity. The answer is to prevent public anonymity from becoming investigative anonymity. An offender may conceal their identity from their target and from the public. That should not automatically mean they become unknowable to every institution capable of investigating serious wrongdoing. Evidence preservation becomes critical. This is why the preservation of digital evidence matters so much. Online abuse can disappear in seconds. Accounts can be deleted. Posts can be edited. Usernames can change. Content can be removed. Entire accounts can disappear. If the consequence of anonymity is that the evidence required to identify an offender is allowed to disappear before anybody takes the complaint seriously, the system has effectively created its own investigative dead end. The response should therefore be capable of recognizing patterns rather than treating every incident as an isolated piece of unpleasant internet behavior. A single anonymous message may be insignificant. Hundreds of anonymous messages, multiple accounts, repeated targeting, impersonation, coordinated activity, threats, publication of private information, persistent unwanted contact or a sustained campaign against one individual are an entirely different evidential picture. Persistence and pattern matter. We need to stop confusing anonymous with unaccountable. This is ultimately the conceptual mistake that needs to be corrected. Anonymous does not mean harmless. Anonymous does not mean civil. Anonymous does not mean unverifiable. Anonymous does not mean impossible to investigate. And anonymous certainly should not mean immune from criminal law. The internet has created an environment in which a person can conceal their physical identity while simultaneously having an enormous ability to affect another person's life. They can reach thousands of people. They can publish allegations permanently. They can repeatedly contact a target. They can mobilize others. They can impersonate people. They can create multiple identities. They can destroy or manipulate reputations. And they can potentially do all of this while remaining invisible to the people being harmed. That is an entirely new enforcement challenge. It cannot be solved by pretending that the identity problem does not exist. The principle should be simple. We should establish a much clearer principle for online policing. If anonymity facilitates suspected criminal behavior, anonymity is an investigative problem, not an exemption from investigation. The more difficult an offender makes themselves to identify, the more important it becomes that appropriate investigative mechanisms exist to establish their identity. The police should not be expected to investigate every unpleasant anonymous comment on the internet. But where there is credible evidence of potentially criminal behavior, persistent targeting, threats, stalking, harassment, intimidation, fraud, malicious communications, impersonation or other unlawful conduct, the fact that the perpetrator is anonymous should not be the point at which responsibility disappears. A balaclava does not make burglary legal. A concealed face does not make assault legal. A hidden identity does not make threats legal. And a username should not become a digital balaclava that places an offender beyond accountability. The challenge for modern policing is therefore not simply to ask whether an online offender can immediately be identified. It is to ensure that when there is evidence of a potentially criminal act, there is a meaningful pathway from the evidence of the conduct to the identification of the person responsible. That is the missing link. And until that link is properly recognized, strengthened and used, anonymity will continue to function not merely as a feature of the internet, but in the hands of people deliberately abusing it as an instrument for impunity.